Imagine living in a world where simply speaking too loudly could condemn you to public shame, where your gender determined not only your role in society, but also the tools of punishment used against you. In medieval Europe, torture was not just about pain. It was about control. And for women, that control took on forms both chilling and cruel. Today, we peel back the curtain on one of history's darkest truths: how punishments were tailored to the female body and spirit, and how cruelty became a weapon to enforce silence, obedience, and fear. Welcome to Dark Era Echoes, the channel where we dive into the shadows of history to uncover stories the past tried to bury. In this episode, gendered torture. We're not talking about random brutality. We're talking about systematic punishment, carefully crafted to humiliate women, to keep them in their place, and to send a message to anyone who dared defy social order. From iron masks that silenced women in public to horrific witch trials that targeted female bodies as proof of guilt, the past is full of devices and rituals of pain meant to control, not just punish. And the scars of these practices reach far beyond the Middle Ages, echoing into the present in ways we still feel today. So let's step into a medieval town square. The air smells of smoke and sweat, merchants cry out from their stalls, and crowds gather not just for entertainment, but to witness justice, raw and merciless. But who decides what justice looks like? And why does it so often look different for women? To understand gendered torture, we have to step inside the medieval mind. Europe between the 12th and 16th centuries was built on a strict hierarchy. God at the top, kings and nobles beneath him, and at the very bottom, peasants and women. Church leaders, philosophers, and lawmakers painted women as morally weak, easily tempted, and in constant need of discipline. Eve's original sin was not just theology, it was political. It became a justification for controlling women's voices, movements, and even their thoughts. Medieval law reflected this belief. Men were expected to lead, fight, and govern. Women were expected to obey quietly. If they didn't, society had 1,000 ways to push them back into silence. Scolds, women accused of nagging or gossiping, could be dragged before a magistrate for disrupting domestic peace. Midwives, healers, or women who spoke too boldly in religious debate were labeled witches. Their very skills turned against them as evidence of evil. Even wealthy noblewomen weren't immune. If they challenged male authority, they risked public humiliation or imprisonment. The idea was simple. If women represented disorder, then punishing them restored order. But unlike punishments for men, whippings, fines, or military service, punishments for women often aimed not just at pain, but at shame. They were designed to be seen. And nothing enforced silence like making an example of a woman in front of her entire community. Let's start with the voice, because for medieval authorities, a loud woman was a dangerous woman. One of the most infamous devices used was the Scold's bridle, also called the brank. This iron contraption locked around a woman's head, with a metal plate or spike pressing into her tongue to prevent speech. Sometimes, it even rang with a bell to announce her shame as she was paraded through the streets. To townsfolk, this was entertainment, a walking warning that women who spoke out of turn would be silenced literally and publicly. But the bridle was only one tool. In Germany and Scotland, women accused of gossiping could be forced to wear iron masks shaped like grotesque faces, mocking caricatures that turned them into living symbols of sin. In England, the cucking stool or ducking stool punished so-called disorderly women. Strapped to a chair at the end of a wooden beam, the condemned woman would be dunked repeatedly into a river or pond before jeering crowds. Officials claimed it was light-hearted discipline, but drowning was always a risk, and the real purpose was terror, not amusement. These punishments weren't random. They carried a clear message. A woman's voice was not her own. Her words could be treated as dangerous weapons, and society claimed the right to disarm her. And unlike punishments for theft or assault, these penalties targeted personality, behavior considered unfeminine, not criminal. A woman could be tortured for being too loud, too clever, or too proud. In some towns, the same ducking stool used on women was used on bakers who sold short-weight bread. But while bakers faced scorn for dishonesty, women faced scorn simply for being outspoken. One was a crime against trade. The other, authorities claimed, was a crime against nature itself. The Middle Ages were not short of punishments, from stocks to gallows, from branding irons to the rack. But when it came to women, the tools of discipline carried a sharper edge of symbolism. These weren't just devices to cause pain. They were designed to shape behavior, to carve obedience into flesh and reputation. Let's step closer to some of the most telling examples. Imagine being led through a crowded market square, a rigid iron mask clamped over your head, your tongue pressed by a spiked plate so you can't utter a word. The crowd doesn't see a human being, they see a lesson in female obedience. The Scold's Bridle, or brank, appeared in Britain and parts of Europe in the 16th century. Its purpose was not execution but humiliation. Women accused of being scolds, meaning too outspoken, too quarrelsome, or simply unwilling to submit, were paraded publicly in this grotesque muzzle. Some bridles even had small bells attached, forcing attention wherever the victim walked. The message was clear. A woman's voice could be treated as a crime. Before the bridle, there was the ducking stool. This was no playful village prank. The condemned woman would be strapped into a wooden chair, mounted on a long beam, then dunked into freezing rivers or ponds, repeatedly. Ostensibly, this was punishment for brawling women, those accused of spreading rumors or disturbing the peace. But in reality, it was a tool for communities to enforce obedience on anyone who spoke too freely. Even prominent women could fall victim, for no one was truly safe when gossip became a public offense. Cold water didn't just sting, it shamed. Soaking clothes clung heavily to the victim's body while jeering crowds watched, the spectacle stripping away not only dignity but humanity. The pillory and its cousin, the cucking stool, were familiar instruments of punishment across Europe. They weren't unique to women, but when women were confined in these public stocks, gendered abuse often followed. Rotten food was thrown, insults hurled, sometimes stones as well. In the medieval mindset, these punishments did double duty. They maintained social order and reinforced gender hierarchy. When a man was pilloried, he was mocked. When a woman was pilloried, she was silenced, controlled, and often subjected to harassment by the crowd. Precisely the sort of public degradation authorities intended. When hysteria over witchcraft gripped Europe, torture became almost ritualized. One of the cruelest practices was witch pricking, searching a woman's body for the devil's mark, a supposed spot where she felt no pain. Special needles, long and thin, were thrust into flesh to test for numbness. Of course, these trials were not about truth. They were about forcing confessions and confirming suspicion. The underlying belief was poisonous, that a woman's body was inherently suspect, inherently dangerous. Unlike the rack or iron boots, which pricking wasn't meant to kill, but to terrify, degrade, and produce false admissions. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe was changing. Enlightenment thinkers spoke of liberty and natural rights. Courts began to rely more on written evidence than on public humiliation. And yet, while the more barbaric punishments were fading, the attitudes that had created them were harder to kill than iron itself. The Scold's Bridle, the ducking stool, the whipping post, they did not vanish overnight. In small towns, where traditions clung like ivy to old stone, these devices sometimes lingered far longer than we'd like to imagine. In Britain, there are records of bridles being used well into the 1700s. In Germany, a variation of the mask of shame still appeared in legal inventories. In colonial America, too, women accused of gossip or disorderly conduct were sometimes forced into public stocks or subjected to the cucking stool. But these devices were becoming an embarrassment to the authorities who once wielded them with pride. As cities grew, as newspapers spread stories far and wide, public opinion began to shift. A punishment that once thrilled the crowd now invited ridicule toward the officials themselves. Are we not civilized? People began to ask. Are we not better than this? Still, the decline of these punishments does not mean the end of gendered control. Even as iron masks were locked away, social expectations and legal codes continued to silence women in different forms. A woman who spoke up too boldly in the 1800s might not wear an iron bridle, but she risked social exile, ridicule in print, or loss of her livelihood. The tools had changed, but the goal remained: to punish women who stepped outside the roles society prescribed for them. It is easy to imagine these punishments as relics locked behind museum glass, irrelevant to the modern world. Yet their shadow stretches into our own time. Consider the language we still use. Words like scold, nag, shrew, all centuries-old terms designed to shame women for speaking too much or too sharply. The vocabulary has outlived the bridle itself, proving how culture often preserves ideas long after it abandons the hardware of oppression. In some ways, the scold's bridle has become a metaphor, an emblem of how societies, across eras and continents, have tried to discipline women not just with laws, but with mockery and fear. And this is where history becomes more than a dusty chronicle. By studying these punishments, we begin to see how control works, not always through brute force, but often through performance, spectacle, and public judgment. Museums across Europe preserve these strange iron relics. In the Thackeray Medical Museum in Leeds, in the Museum of London, in small-town collections in Germany and Scotland, you can still see them. Curators sometimes describe visitors' reactions as mixed: fascination, disbelief, and a quiet shiver. People stare at the cruel tongue plate, the lock, the rusted edges where skin must have once pressed. Some bridles have engraved inscriptions, as if the makers took pride in their craft. Others are adorned with grotesque masks, shaped like the heads of animals or devils, to humiliate the wearer even further. These details remind us that these devices were not improvised tools. They were manufactured, sold, and approved by authority. This was not random mob cruelty. This was policy. And yet, in studying them, historians also find moments of resistance. There are records of communities refusing to use them, of local leaders quietly locking them away rather than humiliating their neighbors. There are even tales, half legend, half truth, of women who mocked the punishment, turning their own public shaming into a kind of defiance, walking proudly as if to say, "You cannot truly silence me." What do these devices really tell us? That cruelty is not just about pain, it is about control. The scold's bridle hurt, yes, but its true power was humiliation. It sent a message not just to the victim but to everyone watching. Step out of line and this could be you. Today, when we talk about equality, about freedom of speech, about respecting women's voices, we are, whether we realize it or not, answering the echo of these devices. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the mask of shame. They remind us that progress is not automatic. It is won, piece by piece, often against bitter resistance. And so, as we leave this grim chapter of history, one question remains. What bridles do we still wear today? Unseen, unacknowledged, but just as real. This has been a journey into one of the darker corners of medieval and early modern justice. A place where iron and law joined hands to silence women's voices. But the story is not just about the past. It is about power, about performance, about how societies enforce their rules. And it challenges us to look closer at our own time. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, there are many more echoes of the past waiting to be uncovered. Devices, trials, and forgotten customs that shaped how we live today. Stay with me as we continue unearthing the buried truths of history. One device, one law, one chilling tale at a time. Because to understand how far we've come, we must never forget where we've been. This is Dark Era Echoes. I'll see you in the next story.